They say old land remembers everything, every step, every tear, every word spoken in anger. The land doesn't judge, it simply remembers. Max came back to his father's house after 15 years away. He didn't come back because he wanted to. He came back because there was nowhere else to go. At 38, he had everything he dreamed of in his youth: a downtown apartment, an expensive car, a director's position at a construction company, a beautiful wife named Olivia who had a gift for appearing in photos at exactly the right moment when the light was perfect. 2 kids he barely saw because he was always busy building their future. Then, in 3 months, everything fell apart. First, the company. His business partner, a man he trusted like a brother, drained the accounts and disappeared. Max found out on a Monday morning when he arrived at work to find a sealed office and 2 stone-faced men in matching suits. Then, Olivia. She didn't leave with a scene. She left calmly, almost methodically, as if she'd been preparing for a long time. She packed a suitcase, took the kids, and said, "Max, I'm tired of waiting for you. I waited for you every single evening for 10 years. You were never really home, even when you were home." He wanted to argue. He couldn't find the words, because she was right. Then the apartment, taken for debt. And so he stood on the porch of his father's house with 1 suitcase that smelled like someone else's life, staring at a broken gate his father had promised to fix back when Max was a teenager. The gate was still hanging on 1 hinge. His father had died 3 years ago. Max came to the funeral for 1 day. He was busy, things to do. The neighbor across the fence turned out to be an old man named George. Max remembered him vaguely, always working in the yard, always in rubber boots, always saying less than he knew. The locals just called him Old George. In the first few days, Max barely left the house. He lay on his back, stared at the ceiling, scrolled through his phone looking for calls that never came. People who used to write him every day had gone silent with a remarkable unanimity. He discovered that in 15 years of success, he hadn't made a single real friend, only partners, contacts, useful people. Useful as long as he was useful. On the 4th day, he walked outside simply because he'd run out of bread, and he found George standing at the fence, looking at him, not with pity, not with judgment, just looking. "You've gotten thin," the old man said. "Your father had more to him." "Haven't been eating right," Max answered, surprised by his own honesty. "Come have lunch." It wasn't an invitation, it was a statement. Max, for reasons he couldn't explain, didn't refuse. George's house was old but alive, the kind of house that only happens when someone actually lives in it rather than just sleeps there. Seedlings on the windowsills, photographs on the walls, some black and white. The kitchen smelled like soup and something warm and wooden. They ate in silence. Max noticed that George didn't look at his phone, didn't turn on the TV, didn't fill the quiet with noise. He simply ate, occasionally glancing out the window at his garden. "It's beautiful out there," Max said, nodding toward the yard. "That's not a yard," George corrected him. "That's a garden. A yard is where you keep the potatoes. Out there, that's life." After lunch, George invited him into the garden, and Max saw what he couldn't see from over the fence. In the center of the property stood a tree, enormous, wide-spreading, with dark bark and leaves of such deep, saturated green it looked like a painter had gone too far. Beneath it sat an old wooden bench, polished smooth, not by lacquer, but by years and hands. "What kind of tree is that?" Max asked. "Pear tree, 72 years old." "You planted it?" "My father planted it. I just took care of it." "Does it bear fruit?" The old man looked at him with a slight smile. "Every year, but it gave its first fruit only in its 23rd year after planting." Max didn't process it right away. 23 years? 23, George confirmed, settling onto the bench. "My father didn't live to see it. I picked the first harvest after he was gone." Max stood and stared at the tree. Something in those words caught him, not like a pretty story, but like a nail that goes into wood with unexpected precision. He started coming to George's place every day, at first with an excuse, to help with something, to return the favor for lunch, then without an excuse, simply because George's house was the only place where his thoughts stopped chasing him with an axe. George gave him work. He didn't ask whether Max knew how. He just showed him and went about his own business. Max discovered he didn't know how to do almost anything. Didn't know how to till soil properly, didn't know when to water, didn't understand why some plants reach toward light while others shelter in shade. He, who had managed hundreds of people and signed million-dollar contracts, couldn't correctly plant a sapling in the ground. "You're pressing too hard," George would say, watching. "Roots don't like force. You don't push them in, you help them find their way. It's just dirt." "No," the old man shook his head. "It's not just dirt. It's someone else's life that you're helping begin. You can't rush it." Max would redo it and think about how he'd spent his whole life forcing things, deals, decisions, people, his own children, into frameworks, into plans, into deadlines. One evening they sat under the pear tree, and Max finally asked what he'd been holding back for a while. "George, did you ever regret staying here? You're a smart man. You could have left, built a career." The old man was quiet for a long time, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he'd learned not to rush even with words. "I did leave," he said finally. "Left for the city when I was 24, worked in a factory, worked my way up to foreman. There was a woman I loved. There was a future ahead of me." "So what happened?" "Nothing happened. I came back on my own." George looked at the tree. "I figured something out, Max. Back in the city, I was always running somewhere. Everyone was running, and nobody could tell me where. Just forward, just faster. Then one day, I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and thought, I've been running for 5 years and I'm not one bit happier, just more tired." "But you gave up a lot." "Or I found what can't be lost," the old man replied, without any bitterness. "Depends how you count." Max looked up at the dark branches above him and thought about his kids, about how his oldest son had once said, "Dad, you promised to come to my show," and he hadn't come. There was an important meeting. The boy was 7 years old. He never invited his father to another show. A month passed, then another. Max started noticing strange things, that in the morning, when he went out to the garden, he didn't have that high-pitched anxiety he'd woken up with every day for the past 10 years, that his hands, unaccustomed to physical work, now ached pleasantly, not from exhaustion, but from labor, that he'd started to notice smells. It turned out the earth after rain smells different from the earth after watering, that the difference existed. He called his kids. The first conversation was awkward. They answered briefly, carefully, like talking to a stranger, which in some sense he was. He didn't take offense. He just called again the next day, and the day after, and the following week. Olivia picked up herself one time. "You've changed," she said after a pause. "I don't know. Maybe I just slowed down." "That's the same thing," she answered quietly. He didn't ask her to come back. He just asked permission to come visit and spend a weekend with the kids. She said yes. Late in the summer, George got sick. Nothing serious, a cold, a week in bed. But Max found himself genuinely worried. Not the way you worry about a business partner, not the way you worry about a useful person, the way you worry about someone close. He brought food, kept the house warm, sat with him in the evenings. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they were quiet. George was teaching him how to be quiet, not the heavy, anxious kind of quiet, but the full kind. It turned out silence came in different varieties. "Tell me about my dad," George said one evening. George stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Your father was a man people didn't understand while he was alive. He couldn't make money, but he had a way of making the people around him feel warm. You know how some people are like a fireplace, not fancy, not showy, but you're just warm near him. He was like that." Max felt something tighten in his chest. "I barely knew him." "I know. I always thought I'd have more time." "Everyone thinks that," George said it without reproach. "Time is the biggest illusion we've got. We think there's plenty of it. Then we look back and all we see is what we didn't do." Max went out to the garden. stood under the pear tree that a stranger's father had planted 72 years ago and cried. Not out of self-pity, no. He cried for the father he never took the time to know, for the childhood that passed by while he was getting ready for adult life, for the wife who waited 10 years and finally got tired of waiting. The tree stood over him in silence. The wind barely moved the branches. The pears, heavy, amber-colored, hung there dense and certain, like something that had weathered everything and stayed. In the fall, the kids came. Max had invited them himself, just like that, no occasion. His older son, Tyler, who had just turned 14, walked around the garden with the expression of someone who doesn't know how to act. Max didn't push. He just worked nearby, explaining things occasionally, why this branch needed trimming, why you mulch the roots before winter. Tyler listened while pretending not to listen. His younger daughter, Sophie, who was 9, climbed straight up into the pear tree. George, fully recovered, watched her from below with a smile Max had never seen on him before. "Is this your tree, mister?" Sophie called down from the branches. "It is," George agreed. "Did you plant it?" "My father planted it." "Do you remember him, your dad?" "I do." "Tell me about him." And George told her, his head tilted up toward the girl in the branches. Max worked a little ways off and listened. Tyler pretended to dig, but listened too. That evening, when the kids had fallen asleep in his father's house, Max sat on the porch and thought about how today had probably been the simplest day of his life, and somehow one of the fullest. Winter in the country wasn't what he remembered, or maybe he was different. The long evenings that once would have felt like wasted time were now just time, simply time that existed, that could be spent on anything at all. He started reading again. It turned out that in 15 years of a successful life, he'd almost stopped reading entirely, only contracts, only what was necessary. Now he read everything, history, philosophy, and surprisingly, horticulture. He kept a notebook. George noticed the notebook one day. "What are you writing?" "I don't know. Thoughts, questions." "Questions are good," the old man said seriously. "A man with no questions either knows everything or stopped thinking. The first is impossible. The second is terrifying." "Do you still have questions?" George was quiet. "One left, the main one." "Which one?" "Whether I lived right." Max waited for more, but the old man went silent, and it was clear this wasn't an unfinished thought. It was the whole thought, that there was no answer to that question, that you carry it all the way to the end. In the fall, Max got a job offer. A former colleague was opening a small construction firm and wanted him as managing director. Not the money he used to make, not the scale, but honest work. He thought about it for 3 days, didn't agonize. He actually thought, calmly, weighing things. That too was new. Before, he made decisions fast, at full speed, believing that speed was a sign of strength. Now he understood that sometimes it's a sign of fear, the fear of stopping and actually thinking. He took the job, but said up front, "I'm coming out here on weekends and the kids are spending summers here." His colleague looked surprised. Max smiled. When he told George about the job, the old man nodded like he'd already known. "Good. You're happy about it?" "Not about the job, about the way you're talking about it. Before, when you talked about business, it was like war. Win, beat the clock, get ahead of everyone. Now it's different." "Different how?" "Like you're talking about life," the old man said simply.
George died the following winter, quietly, in his sleep, in his own house, with the ticking of an old clock keeping time. Max found him in the morning when he came by with breakfast, and sat with him for a long time, holding the cold hand, not knowing what to do with a silence that big. On the table was a note, just a few lines, written in neat, careful handwriting. "The tree is yours now. Take care of it. It'll stand another 50 years, maybe more. Plant another one beside it, for the kids. They won't understand right away, but they will." Max folded the note and put it in his pocket. Several years passed. Tyler, now 18, sometimes shows up on his own. No invitation, no reason. He sits under the pear tree with a book, or just sits. Max doesn't ask why. He already knows why. Sophie has memorized the story of the tree and tells it to her friends with details Max himself doesn't remember. Kids know how to keep stories. Next to George's pear tree, a young sapling now grows. Max planted it the same year the old man died. The tree is still small, thin, a little uncertain about itself, the way everything young is. It will bear its first fruit in maybe 15 years, maybe 20. Max isn't rushing it. There are things you can't speed up. You can't sign a contract with a tree. You can't put a deadline on trust. You can't optimize love. You can't cut corners on the time you give to the people you care about, because that time is you, the real you, without the title and the business card. George always knew this. Max took a long time to learn it. Tyler is starting to understand. Sophie, maybe, simply knows it, the way children know things before anyone has explained to them that they're supposed to hurry. And the pear tree stands, as it stood 70 years ago when it was planted by a man whose name no one remembers anymore. He didn't know his tree would outlive him by decades, that strangers would sit beneath it and find peace, that his quiet work would become someone's anchor in the moment when everything falls apart. He just planted a tree, watered it well, and went on with his life. That was enough.